What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Before I jump into showing you how to select sprocket gearing and how that will affect the geometry of the bike, let me give you a quick preview of what just arrived. Moto Apex 6 forged wheels. I'm super excited to install these. I cannot install them yet because I'm waiting for front Brembo rotors with some bolts so that I can install them, some brake pads. I'm waiting for a rear sprocket because these wheels do not take the stock rear sprocket or the stock bolt pattern that comes with the RSV4, and I'm also waiting for a rear brake rotor and also some Pirelli's Supercorsas V4, the new ones, so I can install the whole thing. So I'm gonna do a video of installation for these wheels and a ride review, so I can go over how it feels to ride forged wheels compared to stock wheels. And these will be with the normal steel bearings. I'm not doing ceramic bearings. What I'm thinking I'm going to do is do a ride review with steel bearings, then get the feedback from it, and then install the ceramic bearings and make a review video for that. So let's just go ahead and start with how to select gearing and how can that affect the geometry of the bike. Okay, so before I jump into showing you what website I use to calculate the sprocket selection for me, I want to go over some items here while I'm here in front of the bike to show you how a sprocket change can actually affect the geometry of the bike. So most people think that by changing the rear sprocket or the front sprocket, all they're doing is either increasing acceleration and decreasing top speed or vice versa. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. It's not that simple as saying, okay, I will increase the teeth in the rear so I can get more acceleration, because you're affecting a lot more things. One thing you're affecting is, other than just the gearing and the gearing ratio, is one, wheelbase of your bike. You can either go further towards the front or rear. The other thing you affect is the angle of attack of the chain based on this height of the rear sprocket or even the front. The anti-squat, which I'm going to talk about it, and in turn, the suspension. Okay, so let's start with the basics of gearing, which most of you are probably familiar with, but I'm going to repeat it anyway. When it comes to selecting the rear sprocket, more teeth or bigger sprocket in the rear means more acceleration, less top speed, and the opposite for the front, less teeth or smaller size in the front means more acceleration, and a larger sprocket or more teeth in the front means more top speed. Now, there are some pros and cons to it. For instance, if you select a large number of teeth in the back, you may have to change the links of your chain, because by increasing the size of the rear sprocket, you can bring your wheel closer and decrease the wheelbase. Or when it comes to the front sprocket, if you go too small, you can also put more wear on your chain guide. Now, for someone that's riding on the street, could be important because you don't want to put too much wear on your bike. But for someone that's riding for the track or racing, these factors don't matter. Wear doesn't matter. All you want is results. So sometimes you can sacrifice wear for better results. So while this sounds very simple to select, it actually affects so many more things. For instance, I went from a 41 rear to a 43 up. What this did to my bike is it decreased the wheelbase by 9 millimeters. It brought the rear wheel closer. This felt great because it made the bike more agile. So for instance, if you want to increase agility on the bike, that's what you're going to do. You're going to try to bring the wheelbase to the front. But you can't change something without sacrificing something else, because by bringing the wheelbase closer, I actually increased my front wheel lift, which was not ideal, because while you would think that, okay, I'm increasing the acceleration, that means I'm going to accelerate faster, I'm actually not accelerating faster, because if I'm struggling to keep the front wheel down, then what's the point of opening the throttle when I cannot? So that actually did not make me accelerate faster, and I'm going to make some adjustments to it once I install the forged wheels. I'll talk about that. Controlling the wheelbase is pretty easy. If you increase the teeth in the rear sprocket, which means the chain will be more extended, pulling the wheel to the front, you can always add some links to your chain. Now, usually, for instance, if you have 110 links, just like I have in my RSV4, if you increase the rear sprocket and those 110 links brings the wheel front to 9 millimeters, if I want to keep my wheelbase back to where it was, I could, for instance, add another 2 links to the chain. Unfortunately, if I do that, that will increase the wheelbase compared to what it was stock. So see, it's not exactly where I want it. Now, a lot of people are now aware, but there are what we call half links for the chain. Kind of difficult to find really what you're looking for. I don't have feedback on the reliability on adding half links, but it is an option. If wheelbase is so important to you and you want to keep a certain sprocket and you're further away from the wheelbase you want, you can always add half links. That's not what I'm doing. I'm sticking to the numbers like 110, 112. So by increasing the sprocket, you can affect the wheelbase by adding or removing chain links. But it doesn't stop there, because it's not about only acceleration, it's not only about agility, it's not about front wheel lift, it's also about traction and handling. Now, how can a sprocket actually affect that? It does, and that comes when we're talking about anti-squat. Okay, this is a little more involved to go over and discuss anti-squat. I'm not gonna spend the entire video talking about anti-squat. I'm only going to talk about the very basics of what anti-squat is and how you can control it to give you better handling. Now, physics says that when something accelerates, the weight has to go back, and we all know that. If you accelerate, you slide to the back, and all that weight transfers to the back. What will that result to the bike? The bike will have to squat down. It will have to, the rear tail would have to drop down. But if you noticed on dyno videos, the rear tail never drops down. It always lifts. The suspension always extends. It's not squatting. So why physics telling us that the bike has to squat? It's actually anti-squatting. So this is where it gets interesting. The reason the bike actually extends or anti-squats is because there's another force to the bike, which is at the contact pads of the tire. What happens is when the wheel tries to spin, so we can go forward, this force to the front is transferred from the tire, from the axle, all the way to the front of the bike, and is trying to push the bike to the front. So it's basically putting a force through the swing arm straight to this line. If you have noticed, every bike has the pivot swing arm higher than what the rear axle is. The reason for this is because if it was not lower and it did not have this angle, if it was straight or if it was opposite, it would not anti-squat. It would actually squat. This is the reason the bike anti-squats. It's all because of this angle. Now, why is it important for the bike to anti-squat? Well, I'll tell you why. If bikes did not anti-squat, on every turn that we would accelerate, we would probably crash. Why? Here's why. When these forces are applied from the rear wheel to the front of the swing arm, all the way to the front of the bike, when you get a squat, what would happen is you would lose traction in the front wheel because the bike will be dropping down on the rear. So while you're in an angle, if you would accelerate on an angle, it would lift, your front wheel would lift. And if you have no traction in the front wheel, you cannot direct the bike to where you want it to go, so you would crash. But by anti-squatting, what happens is the suspension extends, the rear tail lifts, which means it puts weight on the front of the wheel. More weight in the front of the wheel, it means more traction in the front. But again, as I said, with everything that you gain, you also lose. If you put weight in the front, that means you're minimizing the weight in the back. So while you're accelerating off the turn, if you're anti-squatting too much and you're putting too much weight in your front, you're going to lose traction in your rear, which means you could lose your rear and you could potentially high side, which is not a good thing. So balance is the most important thing to find. For example, if you're coming out the turn and you're accelerating and the bike oversteers, which means it's going more into the turn that you want it to, it means you're getting too much traction in the front and you're directing the bike where you want. Now, if you're oversteering, that means that you may be losing traction on the rear. Usually for racers, this is a little bit more preferable because it's always better to lose a bit traction to the rear and readjust the rear than lose traction in the front. Now the opposite, if you, for instance, understeer as you're taking the turn and you're accelerating, you're going wide, that might mean that you may not have enough anti-squat. What happens is, if it's not anti-squatting enough, so if the tail doesn't lift much and is not putting enough weight to the front, you're losing traction in the front and therefore you're going wide. That could be corrected, for instance, with more anti-squat. How can you affect anti-squat? You can actually do that with the sprocket chains. Now, there are multiple ways to affect or control or select your anti-squat. One is, for instance, with the engine heights, which I believe the RSV4 has adjustable engine mounts. I'm not really sure about it, but I'm not gonna talk about this right now. The other way you can adjust anti-squat is through the swing arm pivots by either switching it or getting other brackets for it. Again, I'm not gonna go into this. This video is not about adjusting the anti-squat. This is about gearing. So with gearing, you can actually affect anti-squat. How? A taller or higher rear sprocket can increase the angle of attack of this chain. Just to exaggerate it as an example, imagine that your rear sprocket was as big as your wheel, okay? Now the chain is coming from here, pulling all the way straight down to the front sprocket. It means it's pulling with more torque. Why? Because torque is the force applied times the distance from the center. So imagine this sprocket being up here. This force is pulling down here from the front sprocket for a higher distance. The higher the distance, more torque. So all that torque would push the swing arm easier to the front and would increase the anti-squat. Now, if your desired gear ratio does not meet your expectations when it comes to anti-squat, you can almost keep the same gear ratio by not changing the rear sprocket, but changing the front one. For instance, the rear sprocket, if you increase it by 2 teeth, that's almost equivalent to dropping it 1 teeth to the front. Now, 1 teeth down to the front is around 2.5, 2.7 teeth in the rear. Now, again, you can't put 2.5 teeth in the rear, it's either 2 or 3, but let's say you want 2 teeth increase in the rear, and that's your desired gear ratio, but you're getting too much anti-squat. You can select that, you can change that by, instead of putting 2 teeth in the rear, you can put 1 teeth down on the front. Yes, you will have a little higher gear ratio, but you will not affect the anti-squat as much because a smaller sprocket in the front will not change the angle of attack of this chain as much as 2 teeth would do on the rear. Last but not least is the suspension. By changing gearing, you do affect the suspension because you also affect the wheelbase distance. For instance, imagine again with exaggeration, if you would extend this rear wheel 2 feet in the back, maybe with an extended swing arm. Remember when I talked about torque, now you have a longer distance from the center of the applied force, which means more torque towards the suspension, which means easier to compress that suspension. So for instance, if you would extend double the distance back in swing arm, you would probably have to make your rear suspension stiffer, maybe change the spring to a stiffer spring. And vice versa, of course, if the wheel will go closer, it's not as easy to compress this spring, so maybe you need to make it softer or by removing preload. Now I have a whole video on how to set up suspension, and one thing I spoke about on that video was static sag. This is why static sag is so important, because you need the bike to be able to anti-squat. When you have no static sag, and again, you can watch the video that I made about suspension, but really quick, static sag is basically the bike under its own weight, the sag on that suspension under its own weight. So if you go back in the wheel and pull it up, you will see that the tail, and pull the tail up, you will see that the tail can be lifted up. If you cannot lift it at all, that means you have zero static sag. I've ridden my RS660 with zero static sag and it was miserable. The bike could not anti-squat at all, and on every turn that I would exit, I would lose my front. It was impossible to steer my front wheel. Impossible, there was no traction, so I kept going wide, and if I would throw more, then I would lose the traction completely and crash. It was miserable. This is why suspension is important and how everything can affect each other as a whole. Of course, geometry does not stop here. It's such a complicated subject that it truly could deserve a 2-hour podcast with experts discussing every single item about geometry. I mean, then we go into front, trail and rake and how the anti-squat can affect that. It gets so complicated, guys, that honestly, I cannot cover everything in one video. I hope these small items that I covered in short period of time gave you a basic idea why sprocket change is not as simple as I want to accelerate faster or I want more top speed. I hope it gave you an idea on how to select your own sprocket chains and setup and chain. But I will also jump into the website that I use because you need to see numbers, right? So how do you know if you increase the rear sprocket by 2 teeth? How do you know how the wheelbase will be affected? Well, I'm gonna show you the website right here on the screen and go over it and explain to you how I use it and how you can use it for your own setup. Okay, so the website I use is blocklayer.com. There are multiple websites out there that you can calculate this, but I prefer this one because it's very simple. The first thing you will have to do is add the link pitch in inches. It will be 0.625, and that will be whether you have a 520 chain or a 525, it doesn't really matter. You need to know your stock gearing for the RSV4 specifically. It's a 16 front for the small teeth and 41 for the rear. And for the chain links is 110. That's where you start. This is what you do to start the base of your setup on this website. And you can see the numbers here. It will give you the gear ratio, and this is the stock gear ratio. It will give you also the sprocket centers, which is at 644 millimeters. And you can scroll down and see it here. So basically the sprocket center distance, if you affect this, it also affects your wheelbase. So if stock gearing distance from the centers is 644, by example, if you add 2 teeth in the rear and you recalculate it, you'll see that we dropped to 635 millimeters. That's 9 millimeters shorter in sprocket centers, which translates into wheelbase. So we minimize the wheelbase by 9 millimeters. So basically this is how you're going to check how the gearing will affect your geometry. Now again, as I said before, a higher rear sprocket can mean higher acceleration, but if it affects the geometry of the bike in a certain way, it might not give you what you're looking for. For me, personally, it did not give me higher acceleration due to front wheel lift. In my case, what I want to do is I'm going to install the forged wheels. Because forged wheels should give me more agility, instead of keeping the wheelbase or the sprocket centers at 635, I will drop 1 tooth in the rear at 42, recalculate it, and add 5 millimeters from 635 to 640. That's still 4 millimeters shorter than stock, which will give me more agility compared to stock. But this 5 millimeters increase from 635 to 640, I believe I can compensate it with the forged wheels. This will be my setup, and I will do a ride review on this setup. Now, for your own setup, for instance, if a wheelbase is something that you care to keep similar to stock, let's say the 41 is 644, by getting a similar gearing to 43 rear, that would be a 15 front, and you can recalculate it, and you'll see here 648. That's a small increase in wheelbase for the sprocket centers. Maybe that's gonna be something that you prefer. Sure, by increasing the wheelbase, you will get a little less agility compared to the 16 front. That's 4 millimeters increase. Now, I spoke before about half links. In this case, let's assume that you want to do a 43 rear, but from 644, your wheelbase drops to 635, and that's maybe too much for you. You can potentially increase the chain links by 2, and that will give you 651. Again, this is a big increase, and this is where the half link comes in. Instead of you doing a 112, you would do a 111 by unmarking the check mark here, only even links, you unmark it and you recalculate it, and you're at 643. That's almost identical to the stock wheelbase. This is the reason you would use a half link. Now again, I cannot speak for half links because I don't have experience with them. For this reason, I only stick to even links. And because this wheelbase is not satisfying my needs, and this is too short for me, I decided to go with a 42 and recheck it. So you'll see here that the gear ratio of a 43 rear is 2.688. 2.688, which is very close to a 1/2 drop in the front to 15. 2.688 if you want to get a closer wheelbase and not a shorter, an increase of 4 millimeters instead of a drop of down 9. Maybe this is a setup that works best for you. So stay tuned for the next video, because I will be doing the install of the forged wheels and dropping 1 tooth in the rear from what I have right now, and do a ride review, because I feel that this will be the ideal setup. Maybe for me, maybe for most too, if that's the ideal setup for the RSV4, but at least for me, based on how the bike feels, I think that this will be the most ideal setup for its geometry in ratio of the acceleration and top speed. So stay tuned for that video. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It helps me a lot with the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.